All right, I think we are.
Here we go. All right, welcome everyone. I am Alex Norman, and with me is Justin. I will let Justin introduce himself first.
I'm Justin Palk. I'm a consultant here at Red Siege. I've been doing InfoSec for about 9-10 years now. Lots of CTFs, and lately have been digging into Azure AD a little bit.
Nice. And I am Alex Norman. I am also a security consultant here at Red Siege. I have been working actively as a pen tester for about 9 years now. I think I figured out yesterday. Prior to that, I was a web developer, so I'm a web developer refugee and getting into Azure AD more. So as we said in the pre-show, I don't know if anybody saw it, but Quincy on the Discord had a post about, let's see, it was in February. So a couple of months ago now, or a month ago now, where he said he would like to hear more about Azure AD. So that's where this idea came from. So we do pay attention to Discord, and we do get ideas from there. So if you have something you want us to cover or something you want us to take a look at, we absolutely do keep an eye on that. But today we're going to talk about Azure. So let's get started. Let's see if JCon is going to bring up the slides.
There we go.
All right. So just a quick agenda for today. We're going to talk about what is Azure, and this is mostly from like a penetration testing perspective. That answer could probably fill hours and hours of content. We're going to talk about some initial recon. This would be external recon. We're going to talk about some initial access tactics that we've been using and things that we've been seeing thus far. So this is going to be a smaller part of a subject because this is what we're seeing on our tests. And we're going to talk about what I call Recon Round 1.5. This is where you have access, but maybe not like global administrator access or something like that. And then we'll review some useful tools and people to follow to get further, more drilled down information. All right. So what is Azure? What are we dealing with here? And I guess the first question or the first confusion that I've absolutely run into, and I know Justin has run into this as well, is like, is this just Active Directory? Because it's Azure AD, right?
Yeah. So to be clear, we're talking about Azure AD here, not Azure as a whole, because Azure as a whole is an entire cloud computing environment, if you aren't aware of that.
Right. And Azure AD just kind of refers to anything that's a subscription that you can get through Microsoft under the umbrella of Azure. So let's see. Under the taxonomy of Azure AD, you have generally Azure AD, which is kind of, it seems to be a catch-all marketing term for anything that you may subscribe to. So you could call that, security stuff or apps or anything else. It sounds like it could be Active Directory, but it isn't. If you want to run an Active Directory type deployment under Azure, you have to use Azure AD Domain Services, which is very strange. You get into the situation there where you can run a domain in Azure completely, or you can run a domain on your on-prem, or you can run what's called a hybrid, where you're syncing things back and forth. Then there's other services. Now, to get into other services, that is a massive umbrella. I think there's something like 600 possible services under Azure. So it's a big area to look at. Specific ones that we look at under the security umbrella, that's Active Directory, multi-factor auth, key vaults, stuff like that. Under apps, we have like web, mobile, APIs, things like that. Under computing, that's your traditional VMs or containers. Under data, that would be any kind of database. So a SQL database, Redis, any sort of large data storage. Under hybrid stuff, that's when you're talking about your Azure AD that's then linked to an on-prem AD. That can also include backups and things like that. So you're backing up a on-prem infrastructure to Azure. And then we have infrastructure. So that's your storage, blobs, files, disks, things like that. Now, this talk is absolutely not exhaustive. There's a lot of layers to Azure. And actually, there's a really excellent Twitter post, and I'll drop it in the Discord right now. There's an excellent Twitter post about, and that's the third section. But if you read back through that thread, Andy Robbins talked about basically where are we in Azure compared to where we are in Active Directory, and he had a timeline of kind of like, here's all of the different issues and vulnerabilities that have been found in Active Directory over the X number of years. And then he said, now let's compare it to Azure. And the timeline was this long, and he was like, we are here. and there's all this unknown space out front. And I've talked with a few people who work in Azure, and Justin, I know you probably had some conversations about this around Shmoo as well. Was just asking people, who do you follow? Who do you ask questions of? And people said, it's new.
That said, Alex has been building a rather substantial list because there are some good people. We'll be sharing that a little later in the talk.
Absolutely.
So that said, so Azure AD is basically how you control access to all the stuff in Azure. Like Alex said, Azure AD is not traditional AD. There are ways to link them, federate them, and there's a way to put, traditional Active Directory up in the cloud with Azure Active Directory domain services. We're focusing primarily on the bit that's Azure AD controlling access to Azure things. So basically what you've got is there's two parts. There's roles, and then there's scopes. So scopes, actually, sorry, no, we're going to talk about roles first. So if you look at the Microsoft documentation, sort of like their overview of how to control access with Azure AD, they'll sort of say, well, there are several roles in on that page. There are several built-in roles for Azure AD. Several is an understatement. There are approximately, I counted a couple weeks ago, 240 default roles that exist in Azure AD, and then you can go and build custom roles if that's something you want to do. So there's a lot there. There's 4 roles you really need to be concerned about on a regular basis that are, the ones you're going to be looking out for and seeing a lot. So that's going to be your owners, contributors, your readers, and your user access administrators. Your owner is exactly what it sounds like. In a given scope, it's got full control of all the resources there. It can create things, it can destroy things, it can control other people's access. That's the person who, it's the owner. This thing is mine. Then you've got a contributor. They've still got some elevated privileges, but the key thing they don't have is the ability to modify or assign RBAC roles for other people. So your contributor may be able to create and destroy things and edit things and read them, but it can't give anybody else access who doesn't already have it. Then you've got your reader, and that's sort of a you can look but you can't touch kind of a role. That's sort of your basic access. And then there's your user access admin, which is kind of the flip side of the contributor. They can't do anything to the objects in the scope, but the one thing they can do is control other people's access. So if you've got user access administrator rights on something, you can't read it yourself, but you can give rights to somebody else. So if you control a second account, you give that account access, and now it can go in and do things. The other special one globally is appropriate enough, the global admin, the global administrator. It's not the same as domain admin, but it's got similar impact. It can reset all user passwords. It has all admin privilege. It can elevate its privileges to manage all subscriptions and resource groups. So if you manage to pop a global admin, you've basically got control of the entire subscription, or possibly the entire management group, which we'll talk about in a second. And some things I've heard in some of the other places I've talked to is basically, if an attacker gets global admin, you've got a real problem, because there's really no good way to clean them out at that point and make sure you found everything they've done. So that could potentially be a burn it all to the ground and start over situation, or accept a certain amount of risk that you're never going to be 100% sure you've got this locked down again. So those are roles. Then we've got scopes. There's basically 4 levels of scopes, and they build out in trees. Oop, wrong scopes. Not testing scopes. Well, we're looking for the right slide there. So you've got your management groups at the top. That's your highest, most general level of scope. That's your biggest bucket. Underneath that, you've got a subscription. Then you've got resource groups, and then under that, at the lowest level, you've got actual resources. And your resources are, your virtual machines, your serverless applications, your databases, your key vaults, that sort of thing. So the way these come together is that roles and the permissions on them are applied to scopes. And I always hate the taxonomy here, lower level or high level, but basically the highest level of scope. So let's say you're starting with a management group. Anything applied, any permissions applied to that will trickle down to the lower levels. So if somebody has read access on a management group, they will have read access on every subscription, resource group, and resource underneath that. Everything flows downhill. And then you've got your groups. Those are additive policies. So if you've got, somebody who's in the let's say they're in the marketing group, and then they also get added to the web devs group, or actually no, the marketing group is in the web devs group. Anybody who's in marketing automatically also gets all the permissions of the web devs. And so this is something you need to watch out for when you're setting up your permissions, because if you move one group into a group that has a much higher permission level, suddenly anybody who's in any of those subgroups picks all those permissions up. And so sometimes something that seems like it may not be a problem that you move, your web devs into some sort of IT management group. The question then becomes, well, who's in the web devs group? And should they all have those IT manager permissions? The saving grace here is explicit denies. An explicit deny overrides anything else. So if you have an explicit deny applied to reading, this key vault over here, it doesn't matter what groups you're in, you can never read that group. You're locked out of that. So that's sort of the saving grace there.
And one of the, I just posted in the Discord as well, one of the, a lot of excellent information and drill downs on this has been done by Andy Robbins on Twitter as well. He's had a lot of really good threads. And he had a really good one about like what Justin was just talking about with, as soon as you add somebody to a group, it kind of moves your boundary. So if you think about it, like in the old school operating system terms of like ring 0, ring 1, ring 2, etc. As soon as you move somebody into a group, you're moving that boundary. And that's where you can get into a lot of trouble. He had a very excellent, an excellent thread on, kind of describing that, and he has like nice simple flow charts that help you to visualize that as well. And that image that we had on the slide of everything, trickling down basically through the various layers that Justin went through. That's from the thread that I just put on as well. He had a talk at Insomniac in Europe recently, where he talked kind of about the process of finding abuses and not bugs. So it's more of, this is the way it's supposed to work, but you can use it in a way that might turn out to be malicious. So I guess, now that we're kind of through that, the basic definition of kind of what we're looking at here, and the two structures, the structure of the infrastructure, and then the structure of like roles and that we're looking for. The next thing that we have to figure out is, what do we ask a customer when we're going to do a test? Because we have absolutely tripped over that a few times. Because a customer will come to you and say, "Oh, I have Azure." Okay, what does that mean? So, are you using domain services? Yes, no, things like that.
Or even sometimes they may not even realize, if they're not a particularly technical person, they may not realize that, they're not a traditional Active Directory environment. If they're like an all remote company and all their stuff is cloud first. And I know Alex, for example, has had a test where, it's an assumed breach. We get credentials to a device. Alex gets on, and there's just this laptop sort of sitting in space. There's no domain. There's no other network it's connected to. And only after several conversations did it come out, oh, this is all in Azure AD, and no one from the company has ever logged into this laptop and connected it to Azure. There is no way to get to anything else because you have no Azure creds at the moment.
Right. So that's something definitely to take a look at and look out for if you're going to start doing these type of assessments, is to make sure to set that expectations. Like, are you giving me credentials to log into Azure or log into that to authenticate to it and get a token and be a part of it? Or are you giving me a device and saying, try to get into Azure from here? Because that changes how you're going to approach the test. It almost becomes an external test against Azure if you don't have any way of getting credentials or a token or anything like that. So then, we have to figure out further information about everything. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in our Recon and tools about the specifics around that. So I guess that's a good time to transition into Recon as well. So when we get into uncredentialed information gathering, so we're looking for a few things at first. We're looking for information about the tenant, so either the tenant names or tenant IDs. Mm-hmm. We're looking for any domains that may be running through their Azure or associated with their Azure deployment. We're looking for blobs because blob storage is just a common thing for people to use these days. And then we're trying to enumerate. Oh, go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to say, like S3 buckets from AWS, if people are more familiar with that.
Exactly. Yeah, very similar to S3 buckets and things like that. And then, we're looking for valid users. And there's a couple of things that we can do related to that. First, I will copy this link. Dropping a link in the Discord of a really good blog post by Dr. Azure AD, Nestori Cinema. He has excellent, incredibly detailed write-ups of things or of ways to try to access or try to test against Azure. And he'll also occasionally have good defensive information as well. And then I will also paste this site. There's a site, msportals.io. It's a list of all of the Microsoft portals and what their domain names would be. And this could be useful for enumeration from external to be able to start with that kind of root Microsoft defined URL, and you might be able to do a subdomain, which is usually the tenant name, or tenant domain. So that would be like domain dot .blob.microsoftonline.com or something like that. Another one that we're going to promote on our own here is there is an application out there called Office or O365 Creeper. It's really good to use for enumerating valid email addresses. So once you've figured out a domain name about them, you need to basically continually request. You can request from Microsoft, and I'll post that link in a minute. Is this a real email address? The problem is that can get blocked after a certain amount of time. If you make too many requests from the same IP in a row, Microsoft will just start responding to you. Yep, valid, 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 valid. It's just ignoring you at this point. But that really messes up your results. So Justin actually took O365 Creeper and made O365 Harvest, which does a couple of things. And I'll let Justin explain that because he made it.
Yeah, so basically all I did, I just updated O365 Creeper to use Python 3, and I built in Fireprox support. So it's just a command line flag now, as opposed to having to go into the code and change the URL you're pointing at. So yeah, that just stands up a proxy in AWS that rotates the IP addresses, so Microsoft doesn't see you coming from the same one time after time after time, and you're less likely to get filtered that way and catch their, yes, everybody is valid now, because we don't trust you.
Right. And before, what we were doing, and you can absolutely do it in O365 Creeper as well. There's just a URL in there that you just have to go in and once you've generated a Fireprox URL, you just have to go in there and drop it in. I will get to one bit of information about that in a second. So, and then we'll move on to, so you can also do some enumeration just using Microsoft's web. So I'll drop, there's this, if you use login.microsoftonline.com, and then there's a couple of additional pieces, and I'm dropping this in the Discord as well. You can basically use username at domain. The username at the domain does not have to be valid. You can just use fake user at, like for example, redsiege.com. And it will respond, if that is an Azure tenant, it will respond with some information about it. It'll give you the tenant name and the foundation. Then you can use a different URL that I will also drop in Discord right now. to give you the tenant ID. So this is just collecting that information about what Microsoft uses behind the scenes to identify the tenant and various information.
Yeah.
Then the final thing that you can use is, and this is what Office 365 Stealer goes against, once you've created an email list, and that's when you create an email list, you use the same techniques that we all use for various things. You can use cool, you can use dehashed, you can use
build a custom scraper and scrape their staff
Sure.
page. You know, I know there's tools out here there that are escaping me for scraping their LinkedIn sites.
Sure.
Yeah,
no, Kerry Roberts has a good LinkedIn scraper. There are a few others that I've used, where you can go through LinkedIn and get just a list of employee names and then use a known, like from hunter.io, that will give you, or the Harvester will give you a structure of the email address. So first dot last at domain. And then you can basically create a giant email list and then run either O365 Harvest against it, and it will basically filter out the ones that aren't right. So since you're sort of guessing. And then, so then there's the login.microsoftonline.com/common/get credential type. That is the page that you use to validate emails. And that's the one that will eventually bounce you out if you do too much.
Yeah.
Okay. So once you get all that information, and you can also use, to do some of this external, there's an automated tool set by Dr. Azure AD, AAD internals. You can run some external information, and in his blog post up above that we showed, he'll have more details about how that works.
And to sort of loop this back to where we started, internal, external is an odd way of looking at Azure sometimes. Really a more important one is credentialed versus uncredentialed, because there's a fair amount of information you can pull without credentials. But then once you get credentials, you can pull even more information, but you're not really on the inside. I mean, you could, if you've got the credentials, depending on whether they've got what sort of access policies they've got set up, you can pull a lot of this information from your testing machine wherever you happen to be, unless they've locked that out and said, no, our users are only logging in from the Pacific time zone between business hours there, or Bob last logged in Charlotte, North Carolina. There's no way he's going to be logging in from London later that same day. That's not possible. So
and then I would say the final tool. So once you've gone through and enumerated some information about the tenant and enumerated you enumerated about the tenant, you've also enumerated your email addresses and things like that. You can also look for subdomains using Microburst, which is a really excellent tool from NetSpy. And I will grab the URL for that in a minute. We'll talk about it a little bit more later as well. You can use Microburst to enumerate things like storage blobs and subdomains as well. So basically, we're in this process. At this point, we're gathering as much information as we can about either what exposures the tenant has. So that's what we're going through at this point and doing. We don't have a lot of tools to do it, and there isn't a lot of information to grab, but this is what Justin was just talking about with authenticated versus not. So we're not authenticated at this point. So it's very gathering as much of information as we can so that we can hopefully base that or use that as a base for future activities. So I guess now we'll move forward to our initial access. So working on getting an initial access.
So that one, I mean, if you're doing an assumed breach type test, obviously the client may just give you credentials and an access point and say, go to town, start testing like you're a user who got popped, or like you just popped a user. That's sort of the easy one. Otherwise, we're back to other things we've done in the past. We're looking for plain text credentials. Those could be stored in a GitHub repo. Those are getting rare, but they're still out there. I found some on a test not too long ago. If you're internal already to like their enterprise network, look around in there. You may find a way into their Azure tenant or their Azure subscription if they've got one. Look at web servers, look at web applications that are interacting with Azure things. They may have client secrets and client IDs in there that'll basically give you access to that application's service principal. It's equivalent of an account in Azure, and you can start working from there. And all the other things. Did somebody leave a set of credentials sitting in a text file on a desktop? Also, a lot of the Azure, the Microsoft provided Azure interaction tools will cache tokens on disk somewhere, and you can go looking for those. If you happen to get on a machine where someone has logged into Azure, you may be able to just use Azure PowerShell on their device or the Azure command line if they've got that installed and they've been using it. Didn't include it in here. I do have a tool that will basically look at the standard Microsoft ways of caching credentials, and it'll just try and pull those out from an authenticated session. It'll give you at least a short-lived one that you can start using for other enumeration and to start moving around the environment. I'll add that to Discord when we're done here. Typical. Go ahead.
And the way, and then covering the way you'll get caught by doing this. So you're looking around for various things, and Justin mentioned it a few minutes ago, is the familiar location policy. Now, something to know about the familiar location policy is it is not default. You have to turn it on. The person setting up Azure has to turn it on. I do not remember if that one is premium or not. I think that's still a part of the base Azure. I don't think you have to be paying for one of the higher level enterprise accounts to get that, but you do have to activate it.
The familiar location policy is just, it checks to see if this is someplace you've logged in from before. And if it's not, then it'll turn up the sensitivity on some of the other controls, and you may find yourself getting locked out sooner than you might otherwise.
Interestingly, when we were looking into this, the familiar location, it's not just one IP. It submits like 3 or 4 different IPs in the individual request, and they all have to be in the familiar location table for it to accept it. So you can't do a little bit of sleight of hand and get your attacker IP in like a good request and sneak it in there, unfortunately, at least from what we've seen this far.
Yeah, that's specifically for things like web requests where there may be proxies or X-forwarded for headers involved. If you're making a request like that, like I was saying, all the IPs have to be familiar for the request to be considered familiar.
But once you're in there, I think it stays for quite a while. I'm not sure what the timeout is on that, but it did not seem like it was a thing that reset frequently.
Quickly, yeah.
All right, so that's our initial, either getting provided credentials, which is recommended depending on, what you're trying to do and what your timeline is. Although a lot of our users at this point, or a lot of our customers at this point, aren't giving us that information. The next way is the way to get caught in 16 different ways is password spraying. So a really excellent tool for this is from Black Hills. It's MSOL Spray, written by Bo Billick. It's a really good tool for it. I've used it a few times. So you've created your, I'll post it in the Discord. So you've created your email list from, using O365 Harvest. You've got a valid list of emails. One thing we always say, and I'm sure, referring back to Jason Downey's presentation on the way of the spray, make sure to know what the lockout policy is. We ask customers all the time, like, oh, hey, what's your lockout policy? And they'll be like, oh, 3 and 60. And then they'll be like, wait, let us verify that. And they'll come back 3 and 15, so we want to make sure that we know what that lockout window is and what number of attempts we have so that we can, stay clear of that, because locking out accounts tends to make customers very upset. So, but MSOL Spray is great. You can give it your email list, and then you can give it just a single password, and it will try it against all of them and then report back to you any ones that are active. And if you get one of those, then there you go. You have your username and password to attempt to use either command line tools or other things to, it's like connect-AD and PowerShell, and then enter the credentials, and it'll It'll establish a session, and then you have tokens and things like that you can then run further commands. Now, detection on this, there's a lot of different ways to get caught. In base Azure, so you don't have to have any fancy tools, there's just the sign-in logs. So sign-in logs now includes all failed attempts, and there's also a lockout event. So there's kind of two different detections here. There's just, hey, there was an individual failed sign-in, and then, hey, this user is locked because of too many. If you reach the threshold of the smart lockout policy. Then there's a fancier way to look at it, which is using Sentinel, but Sentinel is a premium product and costs money. So as Justin just said, it's expensive, which I know is a frustration in the defensive community. I believe I was reading a tweet this morning where people were saying, it's not a good idea to put the security tools and the protective tools behind a wall of having to pay more for them, because many of our customers then are going to have to make that choice, and it's a lot. It's a business expense. It's an overall loss that they're going to have to decide is worth it. And I'm buying Azure. It should just be secure out of the box, right? It's fine. So you get into that situation where you're asking people to pay a premium for security, and they're not going to do it, or they're going to make a different, a return on investment choice. But anyway, so you can use Sentinel to pull from. You can use KQL, which is the query language, to query against Azure logs under Sentinel. Another detection is if you're using Azure Identity Protection, which is another premium feature. There is a actual password spray attack notification. Sentinel is incredibly expensive. Yeah. Yes. And then there's also Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, which leads us back to our favorite Microsoft Defender joke, which is everything is Microsoft Defender. So like Word is Microsoft Defender for word processing. But if you use Microsoft Defender, then there is a suspicious activity notification as well. So there's a lot of different ways to possibly get caught or get noted. Let's see. I imagine you could probably get applied Azure policy from the resource group, but I don't know if that requires higher privilege user or not. That is a good question.
Yeah, and so linking that back to Quincy's question just a moment before, any way to determine that at the recon stage about the familiar location policy. I did some quick looking. Nothing immediately jumps out at me as a way you could find that out, uncredentialed, other than, getting hit with account lockouts more quickly once you start trying like password spraying or something. But that's definitely something we can look into.
So you're meaning, is there any way to find out if that familiar location is on from a recon perspective? I would think that would be a difficult thing to figure out without some sort of access to the underlying system.
Yeah,
I do better seeing up event hubs and having those set up to forward to your SIM. That could absolutely be a solution. So forward the logs to a SIM and then try to process them as well. Yeah. Okay. So that's our kind of initial, and the funny thing is, so a lot of us have been taking various Azure courses, and there was one unit where we did, where somebody, showed us password spraying, and they were like, "Don't ever do this. It's a bad idea." We were like, "But password spraying is a legitimate technique, right?"
And of course it was, don't ever do this. This is really dangerous. Let me show you how to do this.
Exactly. So, super safe. So the next
on phishing and consent grants.
Yep. The next one that we need to look at, or the next type of attack against Azure for initial access, is consent granting. Now, consent granting is a little weird. It gets a little weird like everything in Azure very quickly. But the basic thing is, as an attacker, I can set up an Azure of my own, and I can make apps in the Azure, and I can send a link to somebody else, say my customer, and say, "Hey, I made this app, and I really need you to click on this link to go to it." And the customer is like, "All right, well, this looks legit. Somebody said this would be coming," or whatever, whatever our pretext is for sending that. They click on the link and it says, "Hey, for you to use this, I really need you to click OK to allow certain things for it to work." And the customer says, "Well, okay, this is Azure. It does that to me all the time. Okay." What potentially may have happened. And some of this can be recon, depending on where you are, again, in the level of access and what you can get information about. And some of it can just be guessing or making an educated guess, right? If we find on LinkedIn somebody works in HR and we want to get to HR data, we're probably going to phish them. Or we find a system administrator on LinkedIn, we might send them something because we know they might have greater access within the overall environment. So that's why we want to phish those people first. So this would be a similar example. We see somebody who's like their cloud administrator or something like that. We're going to send them a phishing link trying to get them to click on this. And then again, what the consent granting does is it basically says from the object or from the entity on this Azure, it's going to grant consent across and send the required or the requested information. So if I request your username and your token and a couple other things, then I can potentially, if you have sent that to me, I now have that, I can now turn around and use your token. So it's a way to kind of power up phishing specifically against Azure. So we do need some inside information for this to be effective. We need somebody to phish. We need to set up our attack
Azure application.
And then preferably we would like to know what kind of things they can consent to, because you can control a little bit what a user can consent to within Azure. But if we don't know that, like I said, we can guess. Now, detection on this. Azure Sentinel, expensive, again, has a suspicious consent alert. It will actually say, hey, this person just consented to a thing. And I don't think that it's not, well, one, it's not within my tenant, so that's weird. Two, nobody's ever done this before. So Azure will basically just say, or Sentinel will basically just say, this seems fishy. You should check up on it. Then there's also the Defender portal. You can actually go into your audit logs, you can search, and there's an activity that equals consent to application, and it can show what apps have consented to what. So if, for example, like one of your web apps has delegated consent across, you can see that. That to me feels like a thing that is time dependent as well, as we're seeing, with latest breaches that may have happened in January and weren't detected or notified to anyone for 2 months. Things like that happen. And in my experience with pen tests or ransomware or anything like that, you have days, if not hours, not months, to respond to a thing. So it all kind of depends on how often somebody is looking at that specific alert. So I would say the level of getting caught versus password spraying would be a little bit lower.
Yeah, probably.
And then that's pretty much it for consent grants. So I think the next one is you, Justin.
So yeah, another way to potentially get in from the outside is if you can get command execution on an Azure hosted web application, you may be able to get access to the Azure metadata service on the back end. And this is a service that exists basically in all three of the big cloud platforms. GCP, AWS, and Azure all have some version of this, where basically you can go to the back end and ask for data, ask for data about the compute instance that you're on. And in a lot of cases, this can actually include a token that will then allow you to act as that, that virtual machine or that application. That's a good one if you can find it, but you first got to find a vulnerable web application that you can get at. Again, that's another one that might work easier on the inside. If you're starting as an internal and you've managed to find a way to pivot into Azure, and you can get a toehold on a machine there, that's a good one to take a look at.
Sure. I'd like to point out a couple of really good comments on the previous consent granting. Mike Pagan said, application consent per user can be blocked and turned into a request for an admin to review and authorize. Absolutely. And that would be something that we would recommend if we found a case where somebody had consent granting rights. And then somebody said, Kurt Schroeder said, Defender for web apps has malicious OAuth app consent alarm. So it does have an alarm in it as well. And Microsoft is updating these things like constantly. There's so many details that it blows my mind some days. And my Azure Twitter feed is getting a little nuts at this point, to be honest. But yeah, those are absolutely good points and things that can be done. I don't know if the application consent per user is set up out of the box. I kind of doubt it is, based on it sounding kind of custom. So that's something I would definitely recommend for customers to do, especially for users that have a bit more access or access to higher level things in the system, just because obviously getting access to those would be a very bad thing. So I think we're done with the web stuff, and we're going to talk about tokens briefly.
So this is basically, I think we mentioned this earlier, this is a lot of Microsoft tools that access and interact with Azure will leave tokens someplace that you may be able to get access to. Common ones: Visual Studio Code, the PowerShell, the Azure PowerShell modules will do this. And there are ways, there are places you can go on disk to look for them, and there are ways that you can sometimes get the thing to give it a token yourself. I can't talk this afternoon. There are ways you can convince some of these tools to give you a copy of the token to work with. It'll be a short-lived token, not necessarily the full regenerating one that these tools may have access to on the reg, but it's at least something that you can take and use with, like, the Microsoft Graph API or other Azure API endpoints to access information and do some more recon or potentially access resources. Like I said, I've got a tool I'll be putting in Discord later that'll go and look for those in the standard locations and try and get you a copy.
Yep. And there was a link that flew in a minute ago there that was kind of related to tokens as well. That's the auto warp issue that was found. That was Orca Security and Yanir Sarimi had a post on that. And basically what he discovered was, I can't remember which service he was looking at, but he was looking at one of the services. And one of them had a place where you could put in, he uploaded a file, and then he could run Windows commands from that file from his own setup. So that, again, this is one of those where you have a little bit of control to set up your own environment. And then as he was running Windows commands, he realized at some point that, hey, it's setting a port, and it's setting a weird port. It was like 40,008. And he said, why is it setting port 40,008? That's really random and strange. Well, he checked what port 40,007 was, and it was someone else's tenant. And by looking at it, he could get their token and access their tenant from it. And so basically he said anyone who was on the same host as him with the same ports, he could find their tokens. Now, that's maybe not something that would occur in a penetration test, because what are the odds you're going to end up on the same host as your target? But this is the kind of thinking where we're talking about tokens. Any place where a token can get exposed. And I remember in some of the classes that we've been taking as well, that, through web apps, sometimes you can get it to return you a token, either through some sort of weird modified request or something like that. What you're really looking for is those tokens or credentials, but the tokens, it's basically the same thing. When you hand Azure your credentials, it sends you back a token. And then I remember us initially learning about refresh tokens, and how basically that just it allows you to keep your session alive, and they're active for a very long time.
Yeah, and tokens in this case are JWTs. So if you see those standard first few characters, EYJ something, the base 64, that's probably what you're looking for there. So
now we have, we're going to assume we've either gotten some credentials through our phishing, or we've gotten a consent grant and we have a token that way, or we found a token through a web app, and now we're moving on to our kind of Recon 1.5, or part 2, as I called it here. I must not have had enough coffee when I made these slides. So this starts to resemble our normal kind of enumeration. We have a lot more to do here. We can search through users, can search attributes for passwords like AD, because they're, you can put notes in the users. You can look for on-prem users versus Azure only users. You can look for users who are assigned to a specific role filtering. This gets into a lot of PowerShell type stuff. You can do your usual select froms and filtering out and using any type of PowerShell to do that type of work. Common tools for this are the AZ module, the Azure AD module, and AAD internals, and all of those can be found on the PowerShell gallery. And recently I just posted that in Discord as well. Recently, I've had some luck on assessments loading to the scope of just my current user, even though my current user on a machine is not a privileged user. I'm not an admin on the box. I can still install some of the scripts from the PowerShell gallery because I think it is either trusted or it has a different level of trust, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. And yeah, just a basic user in Azure has access to a lot of stuff, to view in Azure AD. You can typically, as a normal user, you can list all the other users. You can list groups. You can, list roles. You may not be able to access a lot of resources, but you can query Azure AD for a ton of information just as a basic user.
And there's some scripts out there. I'll post one in Discord now. There's a kind of handy script that I found from a defensive Azure Hub, where it basically allows you to list all delegated permission grants and application permission grants granted to an app. So as long as you have like the object ID that you want to look for, object ID or app ID or things like that, you can basically just say, hey, Azure, tell me all of the permissions that is granted. So that can allow you to filter things and maybe look for that next step. There's definitely a lot of privilege escalation or lateral movement. There's a lot more of that in Azure currently than there is initial access. Initial access is an area that needs a lot more work, in my opinion, but privilege escalation, I mean, look at Carl Fossen's blog, and we'll have a list of Twitter handles to follow at NetSpy. He has a lot of information. He was on the Wednesday Offensive recently talking about some of his research as well. Andy Robbins, obviously Sean Metcalf, people like that all have a lot of information about these type of things.
Yeah, and this is basically once you've gotten your first user, you enter your standard sort of wash, rinse, repeat cycle of, here's the access I've got. What does that give me access to? Once I get access to this other thing, what does that give me access to? And you just keep going until you get to your final target.
Absolutely. Also, yeah, there's the various Microsoft tools. There's also a tool called Storage Browser, which if you have a token, you can provide the token in there and then browse storage, kind of like it's more of a GUI-based tool where you can actually click through and see the files and things like that. Also, if you have tokens, don't overlook the Azure portal as well, just the web interface that you can log into and view a lot of this information rather than in a command line. Just look at the roles in just a nice table form.
And I think there was one you stumbled across, dsreg command, Alex?
Yes, dsreg command is kind of an interesting one. We kind of struggled with where to put this because you have to be on a host. So if you're on a host, you have to be on the host that's a part of Azure. It's connected one way or another. It's either connected through hybrid or connected directly to an Azure environment. And if you do dsreg command / status, I think. Pretty sure that's right. Yeah, there's a standard command, and basically it will dump out all of the information, a whole lot of information about the state of the device that you're on. So it will tell you if it's Azure AD joined, it will tell you if it's enterprise joined, it will tell you if it's domain joined. If it is domain joined, it will give you the domain name. It'll give you specific details about the device, the thumbprint, the device's ID. As far as Azure is concerned, it'll give you a key container ID if there is one. It'll give you a bunch of details about the tenant, which is useful, including things like if there's an MDM, mobile device management in place. It will give you information about your current user. So, if it's workplace joined and information like that, it's just kind of a good way to get a whole bunch of information related to Azure about the host you're on. But again, this is where you have to be on a host. So this isn't external per se. It's more like I'm on a Azure device, but I'm not an administrator, or you don't have to have a token for this. So you don't have to pull this from Azure. You're pulling this from the local device itself. So it gives you a lot of information. Yes, Mike Pagan has dsreg command /status. That is what the overall kind of dump everything command is. So that has been really useful for me to just get an idea of like where I'm at and give me additional ideas to continue moving forward. Other things you can do from here, obviously you can run a lot of commands in AAD internals. Take a look at Dr. Azure AD's website. He has a lot of information on that. Another one that I have to mention because it's super handy and we all love it in the Active Directory world is Azure Hound. So Azure Hound is related to Bloodhound. It's very similar. They're updating it all the time. It's more in early state. It reminds me of Bloodhound 4 or 5 years ago. The only difference between Azure Hound and Bloodhound is the ingester and then how you query things at the end. It still uses the same Node.js. So if you know how to set up a Bloodhound Node.js to look at things, you're good to go there. You use the different ingester from the Azure Hound GitHub on your, within your Azure environment, provided what you need. I'm pretty sure it does use like the AZ module and the Azure AD module underneath there.
It does,
so if you don't have those, it's going to cause you some troubles. Honestly, most of the tools lean heavily on those two Microsoft modules. So microburst, road tools, all those different tools are going to require those tools to be underneath. So if you can't get those installed, that's a challenge to work around.
Or if the client is alerting on PowerShell usage, that can also be an issue.
Yes. If you're in an environment where PowerShell is blocked for various reasons, that can really ruin your day and ruins my day frequently. But then, yes, you bring in you do the same ingester, dump the files into Bloodhound the same way that you're used to. And then what I posted in the Discord is house sex cipher cheat sheet. So there aren't the commands that you can just click on in Bloodhound and run like a query. Those don't exist yet at this point, but you can just open the Cipher console and copy and paste in, and it ends up with the same result. You still get a new graph and information. And yes, somebody said, and it depends on the services of the person who runs it. That is true. All right, so then let's see, detections for the enumeration. For internal enumeration, I haven't seen a lot of detections that are specific yet. I would assume you'd have to do some filtering.
So,
all right, then I guess the next thing to go over is just some of the tools. We have a list of those to show, I believe. So,
and I think we've touched on most of these at this point.
Yep. Let me grab one here. This is an excellent, somebody has been writing up a playbook online, and it's a few of the defensive people that I follow. I'm posting that in the Discord right now. The Azure Active Directory Attack and Defense Playbook. This is great. This is managed by, I'm trying to get to their names down here so I get them right. Don't have it. Anyway. The Attack and Defense Playbook is Thomas Nauenheim, which is great. It's an excellent reference because it goes into specific scenarios and then it goes into all of the detections in detail, which is excellent. It has a ton of detail and they're working on continually updating it. So as new attack scenarios come out, they're going to keep writing those and accepting pull requests to continue updating that information as they go forward. And then I guess if we could go back to the slides quick. JCon. All right, MSOL spray we talked about. That's our password spraying tool. Microburst is excellent for enumeration tasks. And then post authenticated enumeration. AAD internals is great for an external and internal work. The Azure Attack and Defense Playbook is super great detail. O365 Harvest, written by Justin Palk himself, which allows you to use Fireprox, which is great. Azure Hound, the AZ module, and the just the base modules from Microsoft are super handy. And then Road Tools is a similar, it's sort of a competitor to Bloodhound. It's a similar one written by Dirk Jan, who is a really good, that's a really good tool as well if you want to try a different one. Justin, are there any other tools that you can think of from like?
No, I think that really covers the most of it. I mean, the only other thing is, we did mention the Azure console that's easiest to access if you've just got credentials. If you need a GUI interface, that's the way to go. Otherwise, I think we've got a few minutes left for questions if anybody has any. We're closing in on the top of the hour.
JCon, if you want to toss up the next slide, which I believe, here's all the people that I follow. Well, this is not all the people that I follow, but these are the big ones. The Azure Hangout is a website. If you search for that, you should be able to find it. Obviously, Dr. Azure AD blows my mind frequently. Waldo is Andy Robbins. He is one of the leads for Bloodhound, but he has extremely deep thoughts on all of these things. Inversec she does some really excellent blog posts on defenses for Azure, but you can get some nuggets of information about offense from there as well. Dirk Jan wrote Road Tools and has a lot of other informations. Sentasel Jusua is one of the people who did the Attack and Defense Playbook. Let me see, where are some other ones? Fabian Bader, Carl Fossen, Carl Fossen, Fossaaen. He's from NetSpy. He's doing a lot of stuff with Azure and a lot of post-exploitation type stuff, which is really interesting. And those are kind of the main ones that I follow. So if anybody wants to grab that screenshot, or I can always post those in my Discord as well. I should organize all these into an Azure list so I can share it. I will probably work on that. Yep. Any other questions that anyone has? We have melted their brains.
Well, I mean, I think you probably have. All right. It is a lot. It's a lot of stuff.
An info dump, and at the same time, it's really just a survey. This is sort of letting you know what the possibilities are out there and giving you places to start. But there's so much more out there. There's so much deeper that you can go with all this stuff.
And as we were working on this this presentation, the Discord link, that's redsiege.com/Discord, I believe. If you looked at the graph APIs and how they could be used for good or evil, I have started. Yes, Justin, go ahead.
I was going to say not yet. Haven't been able to do that yet. That's on.
I have been very curious about Graph API. I went down the rabbit hole the other week looking at. Thanks, Quincy. I went down the rabbit hole the other week of digging into the Azure facial recognition software, which was not that productive from an offensive standpoint, but it kind of blew my mind a little bit. It was fun.
Right.
I believe on one of the posts that the post that led to that one exploit. Darn it, I always forget its name. The one where auto warp. The post that led to that, it was like I was looking around through all the services in Azure to see which one looked interesting. So it's like just start at A and Sauce Labs plus OffSec.
I'm not sure what do you know what that is, Al?
I don't.
I saw it, so I flew it. I thought you guys would know.
JCon's messing with us now.
All right. Well, like I said, if we don't have any other questions, I just want to say thank you everybody for joining us for the SiegeCast. You guys had so much information. As everybody's aware, you got some else? Go ahead.
I have one question for everybody here. If there's anything else that you want us to cover in Azure, or anything else that you have an interest in that you would want us to dig into and do another one of these, feel free to post it in the Discord. If there's something that we didn't get into that we should dig further into, that would be great. We're always willing to dig more into this, and we're going to have to, because everybody's going to the cloud.
Yep. And as it's redsiege.com/Discord. It'll take you right into there. Almost all the links that that was mentioned today are in both the chat at the moment, but will always be in the webcast section. All I got to do is scroll up to the graphic of the chat and go down. Everything should be in there. Again, I want to thank everyone. I've got a couple more comments, make sure that everybody's good. Sauce Labs is BHIS active countermeasures, isn't it? That's something you guys are aware of. We'll have to talk to them. We'll have to give them a call. See what they're talking about. Again, appreciate everybody coming out. This talk, again, if you wanted to watch it back later, we don't take very long. I'm going to cut some top and tail off of this thing, and you can check it out on the YouTube. It'll be up and ready. Again, thank you for everybody joining us, and we will see you on the next one, which is going to be the end of April with with Jason Downey and Corey Overstreet. They're gonna be doing one. I think it's on fishing and OSINT. Is that what they're gonna do? Is that something?
Fishing.
It's just fishing. Okay, so that's gonna be something really, really cool for you guys to check out. So check out then. I think the date is April 26th, 3 p.m. So we'll see you guys then, and we appreciate y'all. Have a great day.